She should be thrown out like a dog. That furious proclamation from former President Donald Trump recently tore across the headlines, capturing not just the media's attention, but igniting a firestorm of outrage and indignation within Washington. The target? A CNN reporter named Natasha Bertrand, someone who, according to the administration's adamant statements, had committed the apparent sin of refusing to toe the official narrative surrounding United States military actions in the Middle East. Today, we are diving deep into the high-stakes drama that has erupted between the White House, mainstream news outlets, and the fervent supporters of the administration. Brace yourself, because this story is saturated with pointed allegations, clashing perspectives, and an intensity that rarely surfaces so explosively in front of the general public. What is truly going on behind the White House press podium, and why has Karoline Leavitt, the president's press secretary, dedicated so much time and passion to blasting the work of a single journalist? This clash might invite speculation that personal vendettas or political calculations are fueling every angry remark. Or perhaps it is about ensuring that the administration's statements on national security remain unchallenged. In this in-depth breakdown, we will explore the labyrinth of allegations swirling around a preliminary intelligence report, the Iranian nuclear tension, and the broader phenomenon of how media coverage can impact everything from election seasons to personal reputations. By the end, you may find yourself rethinking what it means for politicians and reporters to do battle over the version of reality the public ultimately believes. Before we begin, let us highlight the key points we are about to uncover in this unfolding story. First, we will scrutinize how one intelligence assessment about the extent of damage inflicted upon Iran's nuclear facilities set off a domino effect, reaching the highest levels of the White House. Then, we will examine the subsequent accusations and counter-accusations between Karoline Leavitt and Natasha Bertrand, each one painting a drastically different portrait of the truth. We will move on to the phenomenon of multiple news outlets matching CNN's reporting and why that has not dampened the administration's hostility. And finally, we will see how all this ties back to an incredibly intense dynamic that has come to define the tug-of-war between American politicians and the press. Stay tuned, because this saga is as heated as it gets. Moments before the official press briefing that set off the chain reaction, Karoline Leavitt was seen privately reviewing department statements. Meanwhile, the rumor mill buzzed with selective leaks about a so-called preliminary intelligence report, indicating that Iran's nuclear program was not left in absolute shambles, despite the White House's earlier triumphant statements that the facilities had been obliterated. Instead, the intelligence suggested the strikes only halted or disrupted Tehran's ambitions for a matter of months. This discrepancy sounded like a bombshell in itself. Was the White House overselling the success of its actions, or was the intelligence community adopting an excessively cautious stance? Then, in stepped Natasha Bertrand, who reported these findings with zeal. According to Bertrand's sources, which included what she described as legitimate government and defense officials, the massive blow to Iran's nuclear infrastructure was significant, but hardly total. To hear Ms. Bertrand tell it, the Iranian regime was dealt a stinging setback, yet no one truly believed that those strikes would eliminate the nuclear threat forever. The White House, however, saw her coverage as not only contradicting the administration's public messaging, but actively undermining the administration's credibility during a time when it felt it needed unwavering support. The administration's frustration boiled over in a starkly personal manner. The president himself erupted, calling on CNN to fire her outright, and famously insisting she be thrown out like a dog. Almost overnight, Karoline Leavitt became the face of the White House's counteroffensive. In a dramatic turn during one of the more fiery press briefings of recent memory, she singled out Natasha Bertrand as a purveyor of falsehoods. With an intensity that one seldom witnesses from a press secretary, Leavitt claimed that Bertrand had repeatedly been fed misleading narratives by adversaries of the administration, and she hammered the point that this was hardly the first time the reporter had made questionable calls. Referencing a separate controversy from the previous year, Leavitt alleged that Bertrand had shown a track record of publishing deception, including claims about the Hunter Biden laptop story being part of a Russian information operation. Interestingly, Karoline Leavitt did not stop at that. She recounted with noticeable indignation that this same CNN reporter had been involved in reporting intelligence officials' dismissals of a man-made lab leak theory for a global pandemic, had relayed statements that the administration believed to be inaccurate and had repeated claims that the president once referred to American military heroes as suckers and losers. In short, Leavitt painted a picture of someone who, in her words, had apparently weaponized questionable intelligence or suspect statements to tarnish the administration's reputation. From the White House's perspective, Natasha Bertrand was the living embodiment of the modern dangers of fake news. Yet reality is rarely so black and white. While the administration continued its public takedown of Ms. Bertrand, multiple outlets, including the New York Times and Fox News, soon published stories of their own, effectively supporting her account of the intelligence reports. If that alone were not enough to throw the official narrative into confusion, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth himself confirmed the existence of the intelligence assessment that cast doubt on the idea that Iran's nuclear capacities were comprehensively destroyed. Though he reasserted support for the White House, he conceded that the intelligence existed. One might wonder, if Ms. Bertrand's depiction is so wrong, why are these major news organizations and government voices corroborating her findings? At this point, the storyline further complicates as it collides with the broader American political landscape. Let us be honest. The idea of friction between a president who disdains negative coverage and mainstream media organizations is hardly a revelation in the 2020s. What elevates this situation, however, is the fervency with which Karoline Leavitt has hammered her accusations. The press secretary's approach marks a departure from the more restrained denials typically employed at a White House podium. In an almost scorched-earth strategy, she used words like shameful to characterize not only Bertrand's actions, but also the decision by CNN to support its reporter. And indeed, CNN responded with steadfast resolve, pointing out that it stood 100% behind the story, since the existence of the intelligence assessment was, in the network's words, in the public interest. It is precisely at these crossroads that the story touches broader tugs of war in today's culture. Do intelligence leaks represent the public's right to know, or do they endanger national security by giving adversaries information about our methods and the weaknesses in our targeting strategies? Are pleas for factual accuracy from the White House simply attempts to restore clarity, or are they an intimidation tactic learned from a political environment that has turned increasingly antagonistic toward journalists? And where does this leave the public, who at the end of the day just want accurate information about major world affairs, from potential global conflicts to domestic political showdowns? If you are closely following this tale of raw emotions, sensational headlines, and questionable claims, please consider supporting narratives like this by sharing what resonates with you. If at any point you find yourself drawn into the tension, do not hesitate to show your interest with a friendly tap on that like button or a quick note of endorsement for the content you appreciate. Sometimes, these simple gestures help highlight our collective appetite for transparent and enthralling explorations of political drama. Meanwhile, the White House asserts that the strikes in Iranian territory demonstrated America's resolve. Administration officials insist that the operation was carried out with extreme precision, aiming to impede Tehran's nuclear progress in an unequivocal fashion. The tension behind this scenario is rooted in the question of exactly how comprehensive those strikes truly were. No official disputes that Iranian ambitions were dealt a temporary blow, effectively setting back the nuclear timetable. But from the vantage point of certain intelligence officials, months of setback might not represent the total success claimed by the Oval Office, especially if Tehran can swiftly recalibrate or rebuild. Insiders say that behind closed doors, the Pentagon remains locked in a delicate debate about how to address the conflict with Iran, how to coordinate with allies in the Middle East, and how to respond to voices calling either for more assertive action or for the prioritization of diplomatic solutions. If Mrs. Bertrand's coverage has a kernel of truth, which the alignment of outlets like the New York Times suggests, then the immediate question is whether the administration could have been more forthright in explaining that an overwhelming blow in a single strike was unrealistic. By claiming obliteration, critics accuse the White House of feeding a narrative that stokes national pride but is ultimately misleading. The drama around Karoline Leavitt's criticisms also highlights the White House's attempt to push back forcefully on any story that might weaken the administration's political position. While traditional communication strategy might have included carefully worded statements or off-the-record clarifications, the administration has embraced a more combative style, at times reminiscent of the rhetorical tactics that first propelled Donald Trump himself into the national spotlight. Telling a reporter to be thrown out like a dog ignited a sense of shock, but it also underscored the administration's readiness to command public attention by making extraordinary remarks. And there is another layer at play. In today's fast-paced news environment, a single tweet or a single headline can become the scaffolding for an entire political narrative. Karoline Leavitt's flat-out condemnation of Natasha Bertrand as someone who has repeatedly published false narratives compels supporters of the White House to discount the reporter's track record. Yet for critics of the administration, it smacks of an attempt to demonize the messenger, possibly to avoid dealing with the heart of the story, the White House's claims versus the intelligence community's more cautious conclusions. Moreover, referencing the historical claims about the Hunter Biden laptop story, lab leak theories, and controversies around insulting military officials, Leavitt woven these prior allegations into a consolidated message about why she believes neither Natasha Bertrand nor her sources are trustworthy. The subtext here is that Ms. Bertrand has, in Leavitt's eyes, used her platform to broadcast narratives damaging to the White House. Whether or not one finds these allegations persuasive, it remains an open question if the administration would be equally indignant were it not for the repeated political embarrassments wrought by certain investigative pieces. After all, when a journalist's story undermines a triumphant White House account of major military progress, that alone might be enough to generate intense friction behind closed doors for Mrs. Bertrand's part. CNN's unwavering stance suggests that the network has full confidence that her sources are solid. Major networks do not generally continue to champion a piece that has been so openly lambasted by an entire administration unless they have verified each reported claim with thorough fact-checking. The dynamic becomes even more intriguing when you learn that Fox News, undeniably not an ally of CNN in the broader media sense, also published angles that align with the initial story. And while press secretaries will always spin stories to their administration's advantage, it is relatively rare for the tension to escalate into such pointed personal attacks. The White House's rhetorical escalation, culminating in calls for the CNN reporter's dismissal, signaled a departure from carefully orchestrated calm into something more akin to open warfare. As if all that were not enough, the story resonates with an all-too-familiar concern, that media coverage of national security operations can inadvertently hamper the effectiveness of those operations by revealing details to hostile regimes. Some administration allies insist that what Natasha Bertrand and others have reported basically hands the Iranians a propaganda boon. Any admission from Western outlets that the blow was only partial could be interpreted as a partial admission of failure, boosting Tehran's morale. On the other hand, defenders of the free press say that if the White House claims total success, the public should have the right to evaluate alternative viewpoints, especially if those viewpoints emanate from credible sources in defense or intelligence. Now, if you find these contrasting angles as enthralling as I do, consider staying informed by subscribing to expert coverage on these and other vital issues. Whether you watch the White House Daily Briefing or prefer investigative news segments, a simple subscription or follow can help you remain poised to learn the truth behind tomorrow's headlines. When the next policy or intelligence leak divides the country, you will want the facts at your fingertips. At the center of everything remains that initial intelligence. While the administration continues to project an image of unstoppable momentum, top classification watchers caution that there may be further details about the strikes or about Iran's ability to rebuild that have not yet been publicized. Not uncommonly, intelligence agencies prefer to keep certain analyses under wraps, revealing them only through authorized channels. If Karoline Leavitt's barbed words against Natasha Bertrand reveal anything, it might be an anxiety that the White House does not control the entire narrative. Once that narrative escapes the White House bubble and enters the public domain, it becomes a tug-of-war between official statements, leaks, and the media outlets that integrate all these sources into stories for broader consumption. In many ways, the entire saga underscores a central tension in American governance. A president needs robust popular support to craft foreign policy strategies, but the public justifiably demands transparency and accuracy. When the coverage challenges the official line, the administration might double down, insisting the journalist got it wrong. Meanwhile, that journalist, if well-sourced, can stand by the story, supported by others who confirm its main revelations. the situation can quickly spiral into a high-pitched confrontation, leaving Americans to wonder which version of the truth is actually correct. As each day unfolds, we see how this conflict between Karoline Leavitt and Natasha Bertrand has set a precedent for future showdowns. If an intelligence community finding can spark so much controversy, imagine what that implies for matters such as potential foreign alliances, possible domestic upheavals, or even the next round of elections. The White House has already used this incident to demonstrate that it will be fiercely protective of the administration's messaging, and the press corps is equally determined to continue sourcing, reporting, and publishing. The environment seems almost tailor-made for collisions, each side feeling duty-bound to hold on to its narrative until events or additional leaks force a recalibration. Insiders at CNN have expressed frustration at what they perceive as intimidation tactics from the administration. Others in Washington circles, including a few who identify as supporters of the president, quietly suggest that the White House's approach might be sowing confusion among the general populace. Perhaps the administration is convinced that addressing the intelligence findings head-on would overshadow the victory narrative. Or perhaps it was truly blindsided by what it considers leakers, trying to sabotage the president's achievements. Regardless, the real question might be, how does this shape policy going forward, especially if distrust between the White House and the press intensifies? Keep in mind that no politician, no matter how forcefully they speak, can fully determine how their words are absorbed by the media machine. Trump's call to have Ms. Bertrand fired may have stoked frustration among his base, who regard the so-called mainstream media with suspicion, but it also produced backlash from journalists who see the condemnation as an infringement on their duty to report. Figures such as Jake Tapper have described Ms. Bertrand as a diligent professional reporter who is simply doing her job. Meanwhile, other journalists worry that being singled out in this way can have real consequences, both personal and professional. Harsh rhetoric can escalate beyond media squabbles, turning into threats or harassment that shape the environment in which journalists operate. Interestingly enough, we have also seen a defiance from the White House. Rather than walk back any of the insults, it has doubled down on the position that the attack on Ms. Bertrand's credibility is justified. Officials in the administration appear unwilling to acknowledge the confirmations by the New York Times or Fox News. Some interpret that as a sign that the White House is determined to marginalize contradictory coverage, while others read it as confidence that the administration will ultimately come out on top and that it can wait for the swirling drama to subside. Historical precedent shows that gatherings of evidence and clarifications sometimes emerge weeks or months after the initial frenzy. If, in a few months, it is revealed that the Iranian nuclear program was indeed more resilient than the White House initially implied, that may vindicate Ms. Bertrand's coverage. Conversely, if the intelligence proves incomplete or inaccurate, and the White House can boast that the upheaval was all for naught, Ms. Bertrand's reputation might suffer. Yet at this moment in time, we are left with a clash of convictions more than a set of definitive outcomes. One might argue that we are witnessing a microcosm of how public debate is shaped in the digital age. On one hand, we have a brash White House press secretary wielding the power of incumbency to push back, brandishing terms like lies and false narratives with a directness not commonly seen. On the other hand, we have a journalist who stands by her reporting, bolstered by matching findings from other outlets and references to intelligence community documents. The tension escalates, the public looks on, and the conversation loops back. How do we, as citizens, know which side to trust? Ultimately, the bigger narrative is likely that the administration's readiness to rebuke and belittle a single reporter is part of a broader effort to keep control of public perception during a high-stakes moment. Indeed, Iran's nuclear status is a matter of grave concern, not just for Americans, but for other nations in the region and the entire international community. If the White House exaggerates progress to reassure the public, critics argue that fosters complacency. But if the media exaggerates the administration's failings, supporters of the president insist that can sow unfounded fear and panic. And that is where we stand, at the crossroads between competing narratives. Emotions are running hot, reputations are on the line, and the world is left to wonder just how swiftly Tehran might replenish its nuclear capacities after the reported strike. It all circles back to the intriguing question: was the Iranian program obliterated or merely set back a few months? The answer exposes fault lines within the intelligence community, in the administration's communications strategy, and in the mission of journalists to call attention to the truth. In times like this, it is crucial to stay vigilant, diving beneath the spin to discover the evidence for yourself. So, I invite you to join the conversation. Share your thoughts, your skepticism, and your insights. If you want to stay up to date with timely, well-researched explorations of urgent political developments, remember to subscribe so that you do not miss a single storyline unraveling. These are not just fleeting headlines. They are defining moments in a fiercely contested landscape over who holds the ultimate power to shape reality. And so the drama continues, fueled by a swirl of public statements, clarifications, accusations, and defenses. Karoline Leavitt's memorable performance at the press podium might go down as one of the more impassioned defenses of an administration's stance against a reporter. Meanwhile, Natasha Bertrand continues to stand firm, her employer backing her to the hilt, persistent in championing what it calls journalistic integrity. Whether you view the White House's approach as moral righteousness or authoritarian intimidation, one truth stands out. The tension between government officials and members of the press can slice deeply into the nation's discourse. How it is ultimately resolved, if it ever is, remains a fascinating and vital question for observers here and abroad. With that, we conclude our deep dive into this tumultuous confrontation. The immediate future is certain to feature further revelations that might shift our understanding, but for now, may this story serve as a reminder that the modern relationship between the powerful and the watchdogs can flare into remarkable hostility at the slightest spark. The next chapter is yet to be written, and it promises to be nothing short of riveting.